Welcome everybody, welcome to the speakers, welcome to the audience. Thank you for choosing the session about platforms as new institutions. My name is Michael Stampfer. I'm working at the local science and research funding organization WWTF, and I will moderate you through the next 90 minutes. The four speakers I will present in a minute. I think we all agree that this conference and also this day is fundamentally about political questions and issues and challenges brought forward by a strong technological shift, and it's not the first time in history we see that. What we see is a revolution coming and going on, and I think the majority of the participants of this conference will comply with that. A revolution with new institutions in the making. We will hear a lot of that. We have four major experts on the issue of platforms as new institutions here in this session. But we also have existing fundamental institutions of our society, and they are, at least in part, under quite some pressure. The new institutions are being shaped largely by platforms, and these are the norms, organizational forms and powers of the digital, ranging from placeless hyperscaling platform companies to the question of how truth and trust are being constructed and deconstructed. And we are all who were here yesterday, I think, are still under the influence of the strong talks by Larry, by Moshe, by many other speakers. And the fundamental institutions are the rule of law, a regulated market economy, representative democracy, all the things we took for granted, yeah. And they are now at the stake through the shift and the power of the new institutions. And we see fascinating stories of power and sovereignty, and the state becoming weaker and stronger at the same time. Yeah, it's difficult to read situations. Yeah, and I propose that in this session that means you four, try to find out two things: what constitutes platforms as new institutions, and how their key features affect some of the fundamental institutions like statehood or sovereignty or checks or balances and so on. So, in my humble view, it's a shift like the end of the feudal era, or a shift in the industrial revolution in the 19th century, and we cannot hang it high enough, all the terms and the explanatory power we need for that. And therefore, I would like to confront the speakers and the audience with a few quotes from political thinkers of turbulent and radical times in the 20th century, who tried to make sense of the revolutions they experienced or analyzed, or both. And then you can explain what's different today. The first, I will confront Virgilio with Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno, 1944, Dialectics of the Enlightenment, how myths and reason, according to them, follow a dangerous logic and form a poisonous mix, and how enlightened progress itself might be another way to hell. Then we come to Annabelle with Douglas North, a more constructivist person who won a Nobel Prize for his institution theory and about the importance of institutions and the potentiality of virtuous circles. Then comes Ben Snaith with Karl Polanyi and the Great Transformation, whether the liberal capitalistic economy of the 19th century has created monsters by killing societal institutions and habitations or not. And finally, I had a volunteer for Carl Schmitt. Thank you, Philipp, for that. Who in his political theology tries to define sovereignty, the state of emergency, and the evocation of totalitarian monster. So, what will we see? Virgilio, first, you are faculty associate at Harvard Berkman Klein Center, so another Harvard story you can tell us later on, yeah? But your main academic stronghold is the University of Minas Gerais. I totally pronounce it wrong, I'm sure. And your PhD is from the Vanderbilt University, and your current research revolves around social computing, governance of algorithms, social impact of AI, and you will show us a few slides on that. Your most recent book is Algorithmic Institutionalism, The Changing Rules of Social and Political Life. So here we are. And you are one of the commissioners of the Global Commission for the Stability of Cyberspace in Brazil. Perhaps you can later on also tell us something about that. I recently watched with great fascination the Andor series. It looks like something from the Star Wars Andor world, the Global Commission for the Stability of Cyberspace. So, Annabelle Gawer. Annabelle, you are Chair Professor in Digital Economy and Director of the Center of the Digital Economy in the University of Surrey, visiting professor at the IMD in Lausanne. And your main business, or your main academic business, is analyzing digital platforms, platform-based innovation ecosystems, working with businesses, with governments, but with the strong networks of academics. Your degrees are from MIT and Stanford. In industrial engineering, applied mathematics, and innovation. And you have a lot of honors. I will skip the honors, otherwise I'm talking all the time. Ben Snaith is a senior researcher at the Open Data Institute in London, focusing on data societal impact, and ODI is an advocate for the responsible and ethical use of data and technology within the private and public sector. Your degrees are law and urban studies from UCL and Queen Mary in London, and your research spans from the transformative power of data to open cities and connections between ecology and power dynamics in physical infrastructures. And you developed some very interesting toolkits together with your colleagues. Philipp, you are Professor of Sociology of the Future of Work at Humboldt University in Berlin, co-director of the Einstein Center for Digital Future, a great institution, by the way. An expert on digital capitalism, on tech giants, political economy, and the shift of labor-work relations in the digital age. Your books include one with the charming title Adaptation, which means societal adaptation to political and technological change, or Markets and Power about digital capitalism. And I think this nicely also tells us something about your fields of work as a sociologist. So, Virgilio, starting with you, in your work you describe AI-based systems as black boxes with massive information asymmetries, and write about a strained democracy arising from the disconnection between democratic processes and technical control within a public sphere increasingly governed by code. That is a quote from one of your publications, 2025. So technical control as an offspring of enlightened thinking. Technical control as an offspring of enlightened thinking and governance by code leads us to the Aegean Sea, to the sirens, and to crafty, cunning Odysseus tied to the pole, as described by Horkheim and Adorno in the Dialectics of Enlightenment, with the following quote for you. Where the development of the machine has become that of the machine of control, So the technical and social tendencies, always intertwined, converge in the total encompassing of human beings. Those who have lagged behind represent not only untruth, and it goes on, adaptation to the power of progress furthers the progress of power, constantly renewing the degenerations which prove successful progress, not failed progress, as to be its own antithesis. And the end of the quote is, the curse of irresistible progress is irresistible regression. And to the computer scientists in the room, with regression, we do not talk, we are in Vienna, we do not talk about mathematical regressions, but about psychological ones. Your turn.
Okay, well, first let me thank the organizers for having me here. It's really a pleasure and honor to be at the Digital Humanism Conference. So I'm going to use a few slides just to make clear the idea of algorithms and institutions. So I think that the motivation is clearly summarized in the three questions. Why is platform regulation and governance a hard problem? Why is platform regulation and an even harder problem for the Global South? And what are the promising areas for research? So I'm from a computer science department, and the motivation that I had to work on this was I was for 5 years the chairman of the Internet Steering Committee in Brazil that was responsible for governance and also for some of the proposals for legislation. And one thing that I have noted during these 5 years was the lack of theories to support governance and also regulation. So I started working with two colleagues from the political science department because they have a lot of knowledge to evaluate, to assess performance of institutions. And so that was the beginning of this work. And it was hard for me because when I first thought about institution, I thought about big building with ministers and things like that. So then I learned from them this. So, and why is that a promising area? Because we need to understand what's going on, and we need some fundamentals for that. So this is the beginning of our work. And for the Global South country, the problem is even harder because of the power asymmetry. The big techs are so powerful, they can make a lot of pressure on government and also on the legislative body. And recently, because of this collaboration between big techs and the new government administration in the US, pressures have increased on different countries to change regulation or to change the plans for regulation. So those are the fundamental questions. So we started this project 5 years ago, and the first result was a book, Thinking of Algorithms as Institutions. And the idea is that they have a lot of similarity with the institutions, mainly because they shape the behavior of people, they shape the behavior of society, and they do this kind of shaping very often through some black box rules that are very opaque to society. The other point that was the algorithm reinforce visible and hidden power dynamics. And they are not neutral. Algorithms reflect and amplify existing social power dynamics. And we see this clearly in a country like Brazil, where the algorithms drive the flow of information according to different political parties, and we are living in a polarized country with a lot of conflict between the two extremes. And platforms the platform algorithms are unaccountable, and they are also a threat to democracy. So, like institutions, they must be democratized for transparency, accountability, and shared governance. And I will comment on that a little bit later. So, the idea is to go beyond this initial idea of algorithms as institution and look at the new institutions that like platform institutions. And platform as institutions, they function like institutions. They organize contexts where people, business, and governments interact. So this context offered by platform is it's where the conflict and also the good things happen. I would say that in a country like Brazil, the social platforms are very important because they have a lot of useful services for the population, but at the same time, they drive this polarization, the political polarization. And as intermediaries, they reshape how we work, communicate, consume, and relate, driving what we call the re-institutionalization of existing structures. One example is the consequence of Uber, for instance. Workers are trying to come up with new institutions to force new laws to protect them. So, and two examples of these platforms that have a lot of influence on society and on institutions. One is the streaming platforms and the music industry. Apple, Spotify, YouTube have redefined music industry, transforming artist revenue models, shaping listening habits, influence culture, and altering relationships among artists, labels, and listeners by acting as institutions. Media platforms, it's another, they like services like provided by TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, X. They function as institutions, reshaping how media structures the public sphere, and that's one central question for the political aspect in many countries. And finally, just to keep my 5 minutes, the idea, the concept of institution help us to make sense of the importance of this institution. Recently, there is enormous pressure from the US government to weaken platforms regulation, and they emphasize this conflict or this between regulation and innovation. In this article, we show that that's a kind of fake dilemma. And just taking the words of 2 Nobel Prizes from last year, Acemoglu and Robinson, when they published the book, Why Nations Fail, they argued that a nation's prosperity depends on institution it builds. So taking this idea, using this as new lens for analyzing the question, we can look at 2 kinds of institutions. Inclusive institutions promote transparency, fair legal systems, and sustainable growth. And extractive institutions concentrated power among elites, exclude the majority from decision-making, and lead to instability and unequal economic benefits. So we want to see the platforms as inclusive institutions, not as extractive institutions, because in many countries, they only, what they do is to collect data and also to have revenue from publicity, advertising. So this idea of institution, inclusive and extractive, help us to understand this dilemma between AI and between innovation and regulation. And finally, what if we view algorithmic platforms as institutions in the global south? The first thing is that algorithm platforms go beyond code. They shape human-machine interaction and act like institutions through formal and informal rules that we don't know what are those rules. The political science and the humanities help us from the technology, from the computer science area, to make sense of algorithmic platforms by revealing how they operate and shape society. The other thing that we note in several developing countries that people reject opaque systems that make life-altering decisions without transparency and control. That's a demand that society presents to governance. And in the global south, viewing platforms as institutions highlights the need for sovereignty and the local governance in platform design and use. Just a quick example. In Brazil, less than 1 year ago, the Supreme Court has blocked the X platform. And the reason was that there is a law in Brazil, another law, that was approved in 2014, which is the Internet Law, the Bill of Rights, that was approved by Congress, that demanded that Internet companies working in Brazil had to have a representative in the country. And when they changed the control of the Twitter platform to X, they removed the representative office from Brazil. Then the Supreme Court asked them to have a representative. They said no, so the platform was blocked in the country until they decided to have a new representative. So that's an example that shows how those platforms threat sovereignty in many countries of the world. So we can talk a little bit more about that. Thank you.
I'm sure you have other examples from Brazil. There was a great article in the New Yorker about your Supreme Court president.
Yeah, that's right.
And we would have loved to have him also here for this conference. And there are other examples of real, like a putsch, where the platforms were included. Annabelle, we for the moment go to more peaceful territories than putschs in Brazil. In your paper on digital platforms and ecosystems, you describe platforms as the dominant organizational form of the digital age. Could you, in your intro statement, tell us a little more about both the form and the dominance, and what the dominance has to do with the form?
Sure, thank you.
Oh, you get
Let's
a quote?
just stop there.
Yeah, you get a quote. My quote comes from Douglas North, that he designs institutions as humanly devised constraints that structure political, economic, and social interaction. They create order and reduce uncertainty. Do they, is my question to you. And last quote, evolution is a consistent story of incremental change induced by the private gains to be realized by productivity-raising organizational and institutional changes. So North was a very optimistic guy in the pre-digital world. Please comment.
Thank you. Thank you for the organizers for this wonderful conference. It's really rare but important to bring different perspectives and have the ambition to talk about digital humanism, and in such a polarized debate where a lot of people have things to sell and things to defend for private interests. I think these types of fora are precious, and thank you very much. I've been studying platforms, and I have the joy here to have my PhD supervisor and mentor, Professor Cusumano from MIT, who will be talking tomorrow. So I've been studying platforms for, I would say, 25 years. And although I do think there's value to see them as institutions, or value to see them as algorithms, or value to see them as markets, or value to see them as firms. I think that if we sort of pick and choose one of these characterizations, we might just somehow not give ourselves the tools to really understand what drives platforms. So I would agree 100% with everything you say, and I will say let's try to complement that in the spirit of the quotation you gave. Mm-hmm. I think one of the reasons why a lot of people talk about digital platforms today is probably because of 5 or 6 companies whose name we all know, Alphabet, Google, Meta, Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, Tencent, Alibaba, very few names from Europe except Spotify, who started in Europe and went to the US, and who obviously have extremely large market capitalization, so dominate the financial markets and therefore have access to enormous financial resources, as well as political pull, as we have talked about, as well as because of the products and services that they have developed, which most of the world have found extremely useful, are enmeshed in our daily lives, in the way we learn, we buy, we read, we get influenced, we connect, etc. Let's not forget that these are economic also institutions, and that theories of institution recognize that you can have different types of institutions. Market is a kind of institution. Church is a kind of institution. Marriage is a kind of institution. So institution is an appealing and evocative framework in order to say these are logics. They have institutional logics that do have influence in a way that structures action, and oftentimes using norms, that is, using implicit rules that people might not entirely be aware of. So I think it's helpful to especially when we speak about algorithms, building on Lessig, who was talking about code is law many years ago, it is useful, and I think most people in this room, and increasingly a number of people understand, that we indeed are influenced by invisible rules which are software-based and which shape the choices we have access to, or blind us to the choices we might have wanted to have access to, but we don't. So we understand that. The term platforms is used in many confusing ways. Some people talk about platforms. If you speak to an engineer, they're going to speak about platforms. What they mean is an architecture based on hardware and software that is often a foundation upon which others can innovate. If you speak to economists, they're going to talk about platforms. What they refer to is an entirely different object, which is a market facilitating exchange, buying and selling, such as eBay or such as Amazon Marketplace. If you speak to management scholars, of which I would say of all these tribes probably I'm there, they're going to talk about the organizations, the firms themselves, and the ecosystem of other firms and users which are engaging with the technology. So first of all, I think it's helpful when we talk about platforms, when we talk to each other about platform, is to try to be clear in our own head and try to ask the question to the person who's speaking. What kind of platform are you talking about, or am I talking about? Is it about the platform firm? Is it the platform technology? Is it the platform market? Is it the platform business model? Or are we reducing that to the algorithm? These are actually different objects. And if we really want to make progress to understand why we are at the inflection point that we hear now and where it is going, I think that degree of precision is very important. For example, 20 years ago when I started to work on platforms, there was a huge amount of hope, enthusiasm, and now in retrospect we think a bit utopian about how the internet was going to change a lot of things for the good. We thought that the ossified power structures of yesterday were going to somehow crumble. Everybody's going to have a voice, and the world's going to be a better place. We thought that connectivity amongst users, among citizens, among countries, is only going to bring out good. The pervasive connectivity was synonymous with opening up new links. What's not to like about that? And for those of us who remember those times, it's a sobering, hangover. to wake up in a world where actually, yes, a lot of value has been created, tapping into this connectivity, and we all individually create this value by generating some of that data. And yes, there is this sort of blanket, like a fabric of threads of this connectivity between people and machines and organizations across countries, etc. But in strategy, we make the distinction between value creation, like I'm inventing a new vaccine, and value capture, which is I'm generating profit because I'm selling that vaccine. There's quite a distinction between value creation and value capture. If you look at digital platforms, there is a paradox. The value creation is very distributed and very global. But the value capture is extremely concentrated into the hands of a very small number of business. We can call them institutions. Let's call them institutions if you want. They're companies. Okay? Now, the reason why we talk about institutions, and I think you mentioned that this is a political question, it is not just a political question, it is a question also of economics and markets, but the reason you're right, why is it becoming a political question, is because some of these companies have become more powerful than some states. And therefore, what we see is our older institutions on the back foot. The reason it's becoming a political question, by the way, the platforms didn't never want to become a political question. They were quite happy being in the market realm. The reason it's becoming a political question, and I would dare to say a provocative statement, is our existing institutions have failed us. The reason why a lot of people have been attracted to the libertarian ethos of what one of the speakers earlier called the tech bros was feeding on the distrust of a large number of members of the population to say to them, let's break the institutions of yesterday. What's coming, it's a better future. And remember, again, the sort of optimistic dream, I think it's propaganda, but about, decentralized platforms and blockchain. And let's just get rid of all the institutions of yesterday, states, banks. Now, we are now in this sobering point where many of us realize that the dream that was sold to us, together with the connectivity and the platforms, is actually revealing a different face. Revealing, plain old businesses which may have succeeded because of their investment and their ingenuity and their risk-taking, but once they got on top of that hill, let's call it the monopolistic hill, because we know about digital markets being a characteristic of digital markets is so-called these network effects, which we can say it's a self-fulfilling momentum that if you have a lot of users, a new user is going to get more value if they connect to an existing network of users. So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy that happens, where by virtue of these economic forces, a number of firms have become monopolistic. Mm-hmm. Now, even if, and let's not nitpick whether they got there entirely in a legal way and whether double-click Google should have been allowed. Let's not even go there. Imagine that they have gotten to the top of that monopolistic hill just by being, hardworking, ingenious, and tapping into these network effects. What firms do when they get on that hill, once they have acquired that power, once they're not just the maverick young student who dropped out of Harvard, Mark Zuckerberg, who says, let's move fast and break things, but actually people and companies who have an enormous amount of power over others, how do they behave? And how do we as societies, even if we are only mildly and not very well protected by our existing institutions, to which we might be very attached to, but we are sadly demonstrating a lot of weaknesses, how do we make sure that the power of technology that has been harnessed by the power of innovative business model that have been harnessed by, a big digital market in the US, that have been harnessed by, an enabling regulatory environment, that have been harnessed by our own behaviors, how do we make sure that where we are does not institute a new institution, an institution of influence, an institution of new laws, an institution where we might be losing what had taken centuries to create in terms of rule of law and not just the might is right, representation as opposed to lack of representation, civil discourse as opposed to violence online. So I think the questions we need to ask ourselves is, how do we as a society, first of all, reclaim the space of saying we should have a voice and we should have a say, which is why these conferences are very important, but also have a lucid and perhaps critical look at our beloved institutions. And, I was an expert pro bono for the European Commission for a few years. I loved what they're trying to do. I was pretty disappointed with what they come up with. And I'm not saying let's throw away the baby with the bathwater, but we need to have a more complete and correct description of the phenomenon, which understand the business models of these companies. We need to tap into the bodies of law that actually exist, whereas we had, as a previous speaker, Professor Van der Hurst explained, which have not been implemented. There had been 200 mergers and acquisitions over the last 10 years that were all approved except one or two. Yes, at the margin, some rules of law need to be adapted and need to be changed. But I think it starts with, as we say in French, prise de conscience, by a grasping of consciousness that the questions that are being asked are not being answered correctly if we think in silos. The engineers do their thing, the economists do their thing, the competition lawyers do their thing, the regulators do their thing, which is we make more regulation because that's the output. And we think about the nature of the power of these business companies and propose solutions that tap into the precise problems we're talking about, as opposed to big philosophical problem. Because and I will finish here, when we talk about power, and I will be the first to say, power can be positive and negative. We all know there's a lot of positive things that come out of these platforms, but in terms of abuse of power, they can exist in say, at least three areas. One has to do with competition, so bullying companies and preventing newcomers to change, and in fact, hurting the very process of competition, whereby when we say market solves itself, is because there's this idea that new entrants can come in and disrupt the old entrants. That can work if you don't have barriers to entry that are so impossible that the new barriers have a chance. The second one, after competition law, is the world of work, and I think you'll talk about that more, the gig economy and the new types of work that are enabled by those digital technologies and platforms, which on the one hand are great because new jobs, more flexibility, et cetera, et cetera. On the other hand, more precarity, less social protection. And that's another problem. And the third one we already spoke about, having to do with online harm and societal divisions, et cetera, et cetera. So more questions than answers, but at least let's try to get the terms right and to understand the problem in its entirety.
We will come back to the nature of the institution in the second round. Thanks for that. Two great openers. Next, Ben. One important institution is trust, and ODI claim is advancing trust in data. At least I read that on your homepage. The open standards you propagate sometimes work against purely market and income-driven strategies. Alas, although open data approaches are growing, the monopolistic data-driven economy has evolved and seems to be currently dominating. How dangerous is it? Can we fix it with a serious, and there I found a nice word in reading Kali Polanyi, counter movements. This is the term he uses in his book, The Great Transformation, to explain where and how the old liberal economy went down the drain. The reason for Polanyi was the fixation on markets alone, without commons, without proper societal and other institutions. My quote for you goes as follows: 19th century civilization was not destroyed by the external or internal attack of the barbarians, and he quotes another number of reasons. It disintegrated as the result of an entirely different set of causes. These were the measures which society adopted in order not to be in its turn annihilated by the actions of the self-regulated market. After a century of blind improvement, man is restoring his habitation. End of quote. Unfortunately, one of the forms of habitation was called fascism. do we see a similar movement and counter-movement now? And what's the role of the open data advocates in all that?
Okay, thanks, Michael, and thanks to the organizers. So there's a few parts that we need to respond to. The first, I guess, is a bit of a open data history lesson. So open data is data that anyone can access, use, and share. It was kind of became or hit the mainstream in the early 2010s at a point of what was described as hegemonic fragility. So particularly in the UK, we just had things like the expenses scandal, where MPs were found to be using kind of government accounts or getting reimbursed for things like duck ponds and garden sheds and a whole load of things that weren't necessary for their duties, but kind of shattered the public trust. We'd also not long since had the global financial crisis. So we're at a point of real kind of distrust in old institutions, in the ways of that they were working. So in the UK, the coalition government, the Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition, wanted to launch a transparency revolution. And open data didn't start from the UK necessarily, but that's kind of where some of my kind of experience and expertise sits. David Cameron described wanting a whole army of armchair auditors, so wanted kind of governments to be putting out data so that the people could hold them to account using that data. And the ODI, the Open Data Institute, were created around that time, so in 2012, by Sir Tim Berners-Lee and Sir Nigel Shadbolt, wanting to be an institute that kind of promoted open data, promoted transparency as part of this vision. But from the beginning, our work has kind of sat within the tension of kind of open data for transparency purposes, and then also wanting to create some form of economic value from that data. And I think that tension is where some of our kind of work still exists, and where some of the problems with open data comes from. And during that whole time, there was a parallel history taking place, kind of also involving Tim Berners-Lee, obviously the creator of the World Wide Web. And he's kind of spent the years since he created the World Wide Web trying to return it back to a bit more of that kind of vision that was described. But he's got a quote that kind of sums up the problems with where the web's gotten to. He said, you can't propose something to be a universal space and keep control of it. So the world that he created, the technology that he created alongside other researchers is what allowed the tech giants to exist. And the interoperability of the internet is what allowed their growth. And as they kept expanding, they started consolidating and they started enacting policies of enclosure, so closing off some of the elements that used to be open. And they did all of this partly by controlling data, by gathering data, by exploiting data. And this is kind of where we've gotten to now with a lot of the data being held by these big companies. So the second point I wanted to cover was kind of a direct response. So I wasn't familiar or too familiar with Plan E before I was invited on this panel. So I've spent the last few days sat in cafes in Vienna, kind of reading up so I didn't look like a fool on stage. But some of the things that he talked about was kind of the myths of the free market and the reliance of kind of the market in relying on governments to create the conditions. And we can see this through things like tax policy and all of the states looking to promote for big tech companies to come over, open offices on their shores, open factories, etc. But I think more pertinently for this issue, we can see the importance of the state, the fact that tech giants were aware of it through the lobbying that takes place. So we wrote about this in some of our research into power and diplomacy. So there was a point when Microsoft launched a new initiative looking to influence cybersecurity norms in Europe, and they were described as unapologetically entering the political sphere. And we can also see how they're kind of acting upon our old institutions, more recently through things like AI safety agreements. These are all done in collaboration, supposedly, between the state and between big business. Pliny also talks about fictions and about kind of how the fictions are what kind of creates the value from things like land, things like labor and money. And I think we can add data to that list of fictions, something that has no inherent value, but the value is being kind of put upon it by how the market treats it, by how governments treat it, by how society treats it through things like privacy. And through this, we can then see how users' interactions with these platforms is being commodified, and that's where the value from data is coming from, how people interact with these platforms. So then the third point was onto the movements and counter movements. So Michael, you referenced the kind of the fear of fascism, but I think it's also worth thinking about the fear or the reality of colonialism through these institutions. So there are parallels, and I'm conscious of drawing too strong a connection between these. But there's parallels between how these new platform institutions operate and the old colonial institutions, such as the East India Company. So both are kind of wielding some form of kind of sovereign power, working across borders, working without the say-so of states, working internationally to redraw maps, to exploit and change land. They're both types of institutions are complicit in war, in research, in resource extraction, in genocide, and we're seeing them kind of operate on this kind of similar form of power to how these old institutions worked. I think the main parallel is how these institutions are both not operating as economic institutions, but operating as political institutions too. So in kind of exploring what's being done against this, the ODI kind of positions itself as kind of trying to work against some of these dominant narratives. One of the things that we do is proposing new forms of institutions. We've got a long-running research program into data institutions. So we are probably applying the definition of institution quite loosely, but in more of the narrative sense. So these are organizations that are set up to steward data on behalf of others for some form of social good. So you can see institutions like Open Supply Hub, which is used to be called Open Apparel Registry. They work to kind of gather data across the mostly fashion supply chain, open up data from kind of the factories and the locations across that supply chain, so that better policies can come as a result, so that these fashion institutions can kind of work for more kind of public good. And we saw some of this came about as a result of the big factory fire in Bangladesh, where hundreds of workers lost their lives. So we can see how kind of disaster often raises the need for these new kinds of institutions. And we're looking at things like standards and interoperability, so all of these organizations that are being set up to use data in kind of a social good manner. using things like standards and interoperability to connect and network between them so they can learn from one another so that we can then get a bit more value in this, a bit more bottom-up sense rather than the top-down vision. We're looking at things like participation. So we've got a research program into participatory data, so forms of empowering users to be able to share data, to get some value or to take part in things like citizen science, or through things like citizen assemblies to actually take part in the governance of how that data is used. And then also finally looking at accountability. So we've got kind of policy team that are working on specific regulation, responding to consultations about things like AI and copyright, but also thinking again about transparency. So we've got some work on AI data transparency. So looking at how without data there's no AI. So how can we kind of encourage the sharing, mandate the sharing of the data that is making up these AI systems that these even newer institutions like OpenAI are generating power from. And then finally, things
I
like...
have to stop you here. We'll keep that for the second round because we are quite advanced in the time. Philipp, you get the Carl Schmitt because you volunteered. What's your view on this next society in the light of digital revolution? Might we also in Europe be confronted not only with dominant companies, but also a stronger, more dominant state with digital tools? And no surprise, the quote comes from the famous political theology, line number 1, the sovereign is he who decides on the exception. Der Souverän ist der, der über den Ausnahmezustand entscheidet. And the rest of the essay is a kind of, yeah, the Leviathan is back. It's from the 20s and 30s, yeah. Together with his parents and his ancestors, whatever liberal law scholars like Hans Kelsen might have done to cage him in. So what do we do to have to conform ourselves in the digital age?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. I'm very happy to be here again. Yes, the state of exception. So I'm a sociologist, and I was under the impression that we should do like a 5-minute intro. So I tried to paint a very broad picture, sociologically still. When we talk about the state of exception, and we think about late modern societies, so the Western societies of our times, the US, the European countries you were asking about, I think one has to understand that at least the way those societies perceive of themselves is that they are already in a constant state of exception. They perceive themselves through war, through climate change, through disruptive geopolitics, through economic turbulences, through, if you look at the US in particular, attacks on established liberal institutions, and the list could go on. I think one has to understand that within such a situation, authoritarian and technocratic rule becomes something that is actually attractive to many people. So to engage in the debate right away, I was very sort of thrown off in my own thinking by your quote that people do reject opaque systems of altering decisions without transparency and control. I'd be super happy if that was true, and maybe it is true for the cases you were talking about. I'd say one had to add that those companies and those platforms in general, in this sort of big tech term of platforms, they have been successful because they cater to desires, needs, and longings of people. I think we would be very, we'd blind ourselves just to impose our normative position that I think is true in a normative sense. I'm not sure it's true in an empirical sense. They platforms, or platform companies in particular, they cater to these technocratic and or authoritarian longings in 3 particular ways. I think you can say that the longings within the society of polycrisis, I want to highlight 3 points. Let's do it this way. So the first thing is people are not so much interested in progress anymore. They're interested in prolonging the present. They feel like their modes of living are threatened, they're in danger, so they want to prolong them as long as they can. This is why they choose politics of exclusion. And platforms, in a way, at least the commercial ones, Annabelle was highlighting in terms of big tech, for example, they are organizations that have for roughly 20 years been safeguarding the life modes of late modern societies, high levels of consumption, to large parts by subsidizing consumption through venture capital. You mentioned Uber. Uber for a long time was it the democratization of taxi rides, because it was cheaper than public transport, because it was subsidized consumption in a situation where incomes were stagnating in many countries. So they help prolonging the presence. This is why people opt for them, so to speak. The second point is a longing for a paradox of, on the one hand, people want things to be depoliticized. They don't want to be constantly reminded about the externalities of their life modes and so on. But at the same time, they also long for hyperpolitization, right? So the authoritarian right-wing shift in our societies is one that comes from a longing within society. And especially the social media platforms, they cater to both of these needs. They cater to these longings. They cater to the longing of depoliticization by being basically technologies of distraction. Cat videos, dog videos is what the old people would say. Other distractions, not sure, like dances on TikTok or whatever. But then they also cater to this hyperpoliticization dynamic in ways we are all too familiar with. Third point, in a situation where people feel sort of paralyzed by crisis, they long for new sources of agency. And those platforms, and in particular the people who own and run the platforms, they are the symbols on which this type of agency is projected, and they actually do have this sort of agency. You already laid out the groundwork on how that works. Very, very brilliant. So trust in political agency is basically gone in Western societies. And in this situation, it's the entrepreneurial types of political actors that become popular. This is why, people say, well, Trump, he's an entrepreneur. Musk, he's an entrepreneur. He's able to do, in a Schumpeterian sense, this is what people attach to this notion, to deliver new combinations that classical institutions and their representatives are not seen as being able to deliver anymore. So what we are dealing with in terms of the state of exception is the rise of platform masters, I would argue. The state of exception then is not so much imposed by the state, if you look at the digital realm in particular, but it is imposed by the overall situation, which is paralysis through the perception of constant crisis, which then benefits those platform masters. For the future and the question of the techno-leviathan, it might mean that we are within the West seeing two pathways, one that is actually leading to a merger of public and private power. This would be the case of the US. This would be the techno-leviathan pathway. And the EU, where we see a continuation because of the failures of regulation and so on, we see a continuation of the shift from public to private power through platforms. Thank you.
Interesting.
So, I didn't stop them because they were too interesting, all four of them. We are a little advanced in time, but that doesn't hurt us anyhow. Virgilio starts with a short intervention on Philipp. Yeah. Then short means short. Okay. and one or two other interventions on others just go on. Yeah, you are very adult persons. I don't have to lead you anymore. And then we have time for you, because this, together with what Wendy and Christiane have said, is a very dangerous cocktail we have been presented this morning. Not that you are dangerous bartenders, but the booze is dangerous. Yeah. Please, Virgilio.
Okay.
Short.
It's a short question. Yesterday, Moshe and Lessig mentioned almost the impossibility of governing AI platforms, and that's the correct point. But I would like to bring a new point to this idea of governance of platforms related to that. Because of the pacing difference, companies go so fast, and the government has its own time that takes a long time to get an agreement. So one interesting thing is to think about governance innovation. Can we think about different ways of doing governance? And there is a good example that happened in Brazil last year. We had elections in 2024 for the Congress. And there was one agreement between the electoral court and the platforms for that specific period of one or 2 months before the elections. And in that case, the agreement was to prohibit the use of AI-generated images, audio, and videos in electoral advertising. And it worked well. It worked, the platform representatives agreed on that, and it worked for that specific period of time. And this is something that we can call a tentative governance. Governance for specific points or specific situations where democracy will be at risk, but this idea of governance for some specific situation, that's something that can happen. And using, as Christian mentioned, existing laws. So there was no need to approve a new law in Congress. The electoral court used the existing laws to reach an agreement with the platforms, and that worked.
Annabelle, Philipp, Ben, do you have also one short statement, a question, point to the others?
I was very interested in Philipp's point about the shift between public and private and public. I was very interested in this shifting boundary, which I see a lot happening. One of them has to do with platforms, because they, especially with regard to the Global South, and I did some work with the World Bank around that. Up until fairly recently, our countries, which had sovereignty, a collective sense of identity, pretty clear borders, and they used to organize and deliver public services via infrastructures. And there were a long period of time during the 20th century where these infrastructures were nationalized. There was a vague of deregulation, started in the late 70s, that deregulated in the name of efficiency, and a lot of it was good, airlines, transportation, et cetera, all the way to perhaps with less success in some countries, healthcare and education. Now, I think it's fair to say that a lot of what we're talking about here are digital infrastructures. When we talk about the infrastructure of commerce, it's Amazon. We talk about the infrastructure of communication and media, it's moved to social media platforms. And so the question of who's going to regulate and govern those digital infrastructures, and it's a hard question, because I don't think anybody, and certainly not me, is going to advocate let's have them centrally run by either national countries or the European Commission or some kind of parliament. On the other hand, the situation that we see that these infrastructures which are public in use but private in government and governance, we don't seem to be very happy with the results as well. Mm-hmm. So I haven't heard very convincing or compelling propositions on how do the digital infrastructures of today should be governed. And I have to say that for those who advocate international governance, let's look at the UN for the solution, I am not hopeful at all. The UN, who was supposed to have, les casques bleus, the blue helmets, and they were supposed to observe borders, in different parts of the world, have been basically completely unsuccessful and even fail their own duty in many regions. And so I'm not looking to the UN to solve anything at all.
Short, where are you looking at?
That's it.
Where are you looking at? Okay, that's it.
No, I mean, I'm not. I'm looking to this room to try
great,
to see
here
new
we are.
narratives.
That's a good point. You will come in a minute to take in the first two questions. Peter Bruck, Moshe Wadi, Herr Bruck, short, Moshe, short.
Public broadcasting is a model of shifting the governance and also the resources in terms of media space. How about public social media? It's a question.
Public social media, question mark.
Platform.
When you say how about, you mean should they exist or why aren't they more successful?
No, should they exist? Should the state invest money?
How institutions are built.
Should there be a Brazilian public social media? Yeah, your chief judge will say perhaps yes. Yeah, but what do you say?
Yeah, I think that it would be difficult to compete with the private platforms because they are very efficient and they do things.
As a normative question, it's interesting. I'm always
well, I agree with you, but one of the risks is that government use that for doing politics. So I'm not in favor of that.
Philipp?
Well, generally speaking, I'd say should public media be present in the digital realm? Of course. Should they run their own platforms in a broader sense than they do right now? Should they have their own Twitter or X or whatever? I'd be skeptical. I think we should, if we do think normatively and critically, we should just think bigger. We should think about a public stack that runs from the bottom to the top and enables public innovation. This is to be like a sphere taking out of the market, being really detached from it and able to develop the next technologies. I'm really like, and I don't know how about you two, but we've been in this discussion for 20 years at least now. I mean, when I look at what you're writing and so on, like this whole idea, these approaches of containment, containing big tech via regulation and so on, this has never been sort of a proactive move. It's always reactive. And when we think about the public domain, as you mentioned, I'd say we'd have to think bigger in terms of a public stack that enables citizen innovation, basically.
But you know, these ideas have been around also for 20 years. And sorry to dampen your enthusiasm, but it's not by lack of trying. It's just that countries and regions have failed miserably. There is a whole cottage industry of little consulting and little technology firms whose entire business model is to run after EU money to do these sort of prototypes. And then once a year, the European Commission puts a great hole and everybody taps themselves in the back about those great prototypes which nobody ever hears about. And then when you ask those entrepreneurs what they're going to do with their product, they say, I don't know, I'm just looking for the next grant from the European Commission. So I am very dubious as to A, it will ever happen, and even the very idea to create a stack completely outside the commercial world. I mean, it's a longer discussion, but I think it's not going to work, and I think it's actually kind of dangerous.
To get out of my own bleak mood, a representation by the people, for the people, through the people, and so on was there for 100+ years until the Bastille was stormed, etc. So we should not give up, and revolutionary thinking might be a nice item for that. First, Moshe, then you. And the discussion is open, so we will hope that we can do it until 12:35, so we have still 20 minutes.
So
Moshe.
We're talking about the power platforms, but I want to take it back. It's really about corporate power. Platform is just a new instance. And we talk about existing laws. Corporations are doing an end run around existing law now for quite a while. I end up getting into a subscription dispute with the local newspaper. And I thought they're trying to overcharge me. They're probably doing to many other people. Maybe I should launch a class action suit. So I read the subscription agreement. It says you cannot launch a class action suit. Nobody reads this damn agreement. You rent a car. There is a 2-page contract. Nobody reads it. We have let them basically create an end run around the normal legal system. The Uniform Commercial Code should dictate car rental is a standard transaction, which should be governed by standard law, not by a specialized contract with a car rental agency.
Yeah, there's a certain Moshevadi.
This is really how they're going to control over us, writing the parallel law.
There's a certain Moshevadi who made a very good proposition yesterday on that.
But it's not. Well, my point. It's not just about click-through licenses. Just think about how
whole
you're going through your life,
Yeah.
and there is a web of contracts that you agree to, and they all basically said corporations write their own laws.
I take in a second question, and then you choose who answers to what. Please. Sorry for waiting.
No, thank you very much. Very interesting panel. I wanna come back what Philipp said. It really struck me what he said. People want to prolong the presence, but also they are tired of polycrisis. And I think this is where, for me, the dilemma is. On the one hand, technology companies cater exactly what you said, to these deep desires and needs. And there's, for me, the chicken and egg conversation is like, do you educate a population to become more independent or more resilient? Because we are hunting on the one side now the whole governance model and those platforms, but on the other side there are people, a humanism conference, and it reminds me of a book written by called Time Shelter, that people have the desire to live in the in the 70s, 60s where everything was fine. So, and I think this is a dilemma, and I'm working as a social scientist in this field, and I was wondering if you have any ideas, because at the moment I feel this is a real big dilemma, chicken and egg, for me.
Okay, there were two questions. Please, who wants to start with which answer?
You go
Annabelle?
first.
No, I'm not sure I understood the question.
Well, two short comments on your question first. I think that platforms, as you said, they have one side that people love them, they need them, and there is the other side that people are harmed by fake news, for threats on mental health, things like that. So I would say that one way to create a strategy for that is to increase the participation of the society in the governance process. So that's the way that the voice, the people's voice, goes to the platform. So that's one thing. And regarding to Moshe's comment, I agree with him. If we need to approve in Congress a new law for each emerging technology, that's going to be crazy. So when I mentioned that case of the tentative governance, they used the existing law, and the result was positive.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I try to be brief. So chicken and egg. I mean, I'm not sure we have to answer that question really. Obviously, as you say, if I got you right, it's a mutually reinforcing relationship, and it's kind of toxic, which is what everybody basically knows. I mean, as a sociologist, I describe myself first of all as an observer of social dynamics, political dynamics, and so on. And I think it's really important to get a sort of clear-cut vision of what has happened to the political realm and the ability or inability of late modern societies to control, steer, and govern themselves. One has to understand those, like the emergence of those entrepreneurial types within, because they are seen as the ones breaking through, cutting through the knot. And this won't go away. Actually, I'd say within Europe, we're still at the beginning of this emergent type of political actor. And if you consider yourself being part of what we used to call or some people still call it like that, like the progressive spectrum or anything like that within society, then I think you have to understand that there's no way to really play around that game. You have to kind of enter that game and think about what this does to your core values, your core strategies, what type of political leaders. This is, by the way, why I volunteered for the Carl Schmitt question.
Wonderful.
Because I think it is very important. It basically comes down to the concentration of personalized, incorporated power. This is the sort of paradoxical situation that this dilemma creates. Incorporation of power becomes more important as technology automates all sorts of negotiations and so on.
Interesting.
Mark.
So I have a provocation as to terminology. I think we should stop using this word platform. It's a normative term. The objective word, what you're describing, are businesses, corporations, companies, firms. They have a legal construct, and that's how they exercise power. Platform conveys, particularly in the United States, diminished accountability. It's associated with Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. It means basically we are standing aside, we are creating a space for others. Other people are doing things that they're responsible for, which has very little connection to reality. But you see, we participate in this collective hallucination by restating this characterization by using this term platform. And we help amplify it and reify it, and we should stop doing it. It's the exact same thing that happened with privacy and the term sharing. Suddenly, giant corporations were sharing our data. They weren't selling it, they weren't disclosing it, they weren't transferring it, they weren't leaking it, they were simply sharing it, which is what my kids did in grade school. I don't think that's what corporations do. If you want a normative term, which would actually give your very good discussion more coherence, you would use the word gatekeeper, because gatekeepers are new institutions, and they are exercising power and social control by virtue of the fact that they operate like gatekeepers. So I'm asking us all, please, to stop using the term platform.
That's a very interesting point. My proposals...
predatory businesses, I would propose.
My proposals would have been JP data and standard data to show
I have to react.
Please do react.
I've got to react. I think that I applaud the intent that you want to hold to accountability and to scrutiny corporations that have been hiding behind this label which has been used in a vague way about platform. But if you do what I suggest, which is you don't call firms platform, but you distinguish between different types of firms, because if you get rid entirely of the very specific way in which platform firms not just capture value as gatekeeper, which is the angle you're looking at, but also create value. Because if you only define them as gatekeeper, you completely miss out. How come they've become the companies that they are today? Oh, they are just firms. And one day you wake up, some of them are gatekeepers. Why these? And why not the other? And I would like to hear your answer as how you can explain that without using anything that resembles the term platform.
And another point, I read a very interesting book by a guy called Vili Lehdonvirta, a Finn in Oxford and Helsinki, called Cloud Empires, where the mechanisms of value creation and valuation are that way that it makes like a law, like a norm. The one who invented the platform to the dictator of the platform. So there's a kind of inbuilt digital authoritarianism in the platform. So that's why what I would bring in defense of the word platform. But it's not me to be here, the wise guy.
A lot of questions.
Next here, then George. Sorry, you were first.
There's one at the back as well.
There's a lady at the back as well.
So somebody in the panel made an interesting point, which I think we should go back to, and that is the internet redefined the relationship between individuals and institutions. And I think in that sense, we have to look at these new platforms as an institutional agent. Now, 2007 is a really interesting date. That's the date that the iPhone was first released. That's also the date of Generation Z, okay, which is now 18 years old. This is the generation that has been born into interacting with these new institutions. And what is the normative impact that these have had on their lives? Well, number one, they don't have to trust their teachers or their parents because they have Google. They don't have to use a bank because they have Bitcoin. They don't have to become a member of a local organization because they can create their own community online. I think if we look at these things as more than just companies or some kind of new entity that needs to be regulated, and rather to see the kind of normative change that they made, I think that's the way that we need to understand them. Thank you.
Very interesting.
Thank you.
One or two short answers, then George Metakidis. George, sorry for letting you wait. And you get some water because you are very...
There's a question back as well. There.
Yeah, just 1 second. We have, I have been told by 2 speakers already that you are also waiting. So just one minute.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, who wants to answer the last question? Ben?
Yeah, so on the, I guess, the generational side, so I think it's also not entirely true that Gen Z are looking for kind of making their own worlds online. I think there's actually a growing rejection of the online world, particularly in the face of everything else getting worse for them in terms of the economy, job market, housing market, etc. And there's actually a rise in going back to kind of an extent of how things were before. So there's people kind of rejecting smartphones, there's people who are starting new social and community groups, and therefore looking for an element of their community to be offline as well. And I think that's an interesting phenomenon, that the more that these technologies grow, I think also an acknowledgement of how much worse they're getting. So kind of if anyone tries to use X, Twitter now, it's terrible compared to how it was 3-4 years ago. So I think there's a rejection of kind of the online world that is worth kind of acknowledging too. And with that, there's an acknowledgement, for example, about things like AI and generative AI, that it's not necessarily bringing the value that's promised of it, and that actually using it is kind of not great for the environment, and there's a growing awareness of kind of some of those aspects as well.
George.
Yeah, two quick questions. The first one is concerns billboard advertisements, if one has the answer. If illegal content is placed on billboards, is the company that operates the billboards liable under current law? And the second question is addressed specifically to Virgilio. You touched upon AI governance in Brazil. Can you update us on the status of the Brazil AI Act and whether it's coming under pressure, be that lobbying or political?
Well, thank you for the question. The AI Act in Brazil was approved by the Senate and now is in Congress. And we don't know what's going to be the result of that, because we had a previous bill that tried to regulate the platforms. It was called fake news platform law, something like that. And 2 or 3 days before the final vote, the president of the Congress removed that project from the Congress because of the pressures, because of the big companies that were there. So there is a hope for the AI Act because of the consequences that are being shown in the media about the use of AI to manipulate people, to create fake information. So, but it will depend on the Congress. there is a big difference between the Congress and the executive. The president has one way of seeing these things, and the Congress has a different way. So I hope that they do something, but I'm not confident on that.
Who says 2 words on the billboard? The billboard.
Yeah.
Christiane in lunch break, billboard in the lunch break. So finally, Tada, your turn.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for all of your talks. So I think we've already talked about like AI technology in platforms in general, but my question would be, what about the Gen AI platforms, like these emerging Gen AI platforms like ChatGPT or Cloud, and they have their own platforms? Would you ever consider them as platforms, like institutionally, or would you consider them as new forms of platforms? And what would be the institutional changes like ongoing on these platforms? Thank you.
I mean, there's going to be more about that, for example, in Professor Cusumano's talk tomorrow. But I would say from my perspective, Gen AI is a technology. It's got multiple purposes, so you could call it a general purpose technology. It is neither a corporation, just as the gentleman was saying, we should talk about firms. So it's not a firm, although it's a product or a service. It's not yet an institution, although it is changing norms as to how people access information. And it's got an effect on existing platforms that can either be positive or negative. It can be negative for the business model of some platforms because there are some platforms accessing educators, for example. An entire side of the platform, the educators, they can become substituted away by people who just ask questions to ChatGPT. Other platforms, such as work, gig employment platform, have seen actually that since the emergence of Gen AI, like a company like Fiverr, have gone a lot in uses because a lot of people are looking for experts in Gen AI.
Yeah, so I think also we should think about the way that they're strengthening some of the institutions that we were talking about for the bulk of this. So the kind of rise in Gen AI is going hand in hand with the kind of expansion in this cloud business model, and the number of kind of data centers, the amount of infrastructure that is being required by these platforms that is often being built for AWS, for things like Microsoft, who are running the cloud parts. So kind of a further consolidation of their actual business models, particularly Amazon and AWS. That's where their money is. And then the kind of willingness of governments to kind of promote AI technologies in their kind of every country now has an AI strategy because they think that there's a value in kind of attracting them to their shores, and again permitting this widespread kind of building of the infrastructure that these platforms and the models that they use require.
You are fantastic. It was fantastic. We stop with an exercise. Here you see one very nice slogan: more than money. Please give us one sentence each, you four. What does this mean for you in the light of this discussion? More than money. Philipp, you start.
To me, it means being invited to Vienna again and being able to enjoy that.
Yeah. Wow.
More than money.
I think for me, it's thinking about different forms of value. So our governments have become very focused on kind of balancing the books, etc. But there's other forms of public value, community value that these technologies used in different ways could promote if we looked at that as equal to monetary value.
What does What's the sentence of the valuation specialist, platform valuation specialist?
I agree with you, Ben. I would add more than money to me is the human integrity and respect for the human being. And I think that we need to strengthen our institutions and societies and rule to preserve that as the core of the objective and not get distracted by, say, money as a proxy for progress.
Okay, more than money.
I would say that democracy should be protected against the force of money.
You were a most outstanding panel. I'm not even hungry, yeah, that says something. Thank you, you were a fantastic audience. I take home 3 messages, I take home 20 messages, whatever. I still believe that we are living in revolutionary times, point 1. Point 2, no monopoly should exist except the state monopoly on violence, and no displaced persons or companies should exist in this world, so there should be place-based structures and rules. And third, we need good theories, so go to work, please. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure to have you here.